latest entity to call for a coordinator for government-wide cybersecurity efforts is the Government Accountability Office. It's calling on Congress to establish a national cyber coordinator position in the White House. Nick Marinos is Director of Information Technology and Cybersecurity at the Government Accountability Office. Nick, welcome. Thanks for coming on the program. What did you look at? What was your charge here from Congress to examine regarding this position?
Well, Francis, there were essentially two goals to our report. The first was to provide Congress and the American people with the ability to look at our report and get a better understanding of just how many agencies are involved in protecting our nation from cyber threats. And the second goal was to evaluate whether the federal government has a strategy, a national strategy for overcoming these cyber threats, and where do we stand in terms of implementing them. And that's really where the issue of having a clear leader to oversee the implementation of a strategy came to play.
I knew cyber lived a lot of places across the government from a government-wide perspective. I didn't know there were 23 that you and your colleagues found, entities responsible for enhancing the nation's cybersecurity. What does that say to you? What did that mean as far as your examination of some person or some office to coordinate all of those efforts, Nick?
Well, I think you just said it right there, Francis. The reality is that it's a whole of government requirement. You know, cyber threats are affecting each of us, the entire nation. And so in order to be able to combat those threats, we need the federal government to be able to coordinate within itself and with the private sector, the state and local governments, to really overcome the issues. And so, as you point out, we saw 23 federal entities that have responsibilities predominantly for helping to protect critical infrastructure. These are things like our electricity grid, the financial services sector, the places where there's a nexus between the federal government and the private sector to keep our daily lives normal.
You write in this work, Nick, the White House's September 2018 National Cyber Strategy and the National Security Council's accompanying June 2019 implementation plan detail the executive branch's approach to managing cybersecurity, but you point out that there are some parts of that that you did not find. What's lacking, in your view, in those two guiding documents?
So let me start off by saying where we think there are some good bones there. And most importantly, below the leadership level, we did see identified roles and responsibilities for which federal agencies are responsible for implementing about 200 activities that support the national cyber strategy. However, where we saw them fall short were things like goals and timeframes, ways to measure progress, identifying what resources are ultimately needed to actually implement this plan. And I think that's also where central leadership is really important. We saw that the National Security Council staff have responsibility for coordinating with federal agencies. However, when we spoke with the National Security Council staff, we were told that it's ultimately up to those federal entities to really measure where they are in terms of being successful in implementing activities that support the strategy.
You recommend, as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, that Congress should establish this position. Did you make recommendations about what that person or that office should do regarding the coordination among these 23 organizations, or just that that person and office should exist?
We did, as you point out, we did make a recommendation to Congress to consider legislation. That recommendation was not specific in terms of the types of roles and responsibilities, but emphasized the importance of having reach across the federal government. So that would include influence over budgets. It would include influence over, again, that measurement to see how far along we've come in implementing the strategy. I think the important thing here is that the reality is that you look at even what we're living through today from a pandemic perspective, and it just shows how cyber threats are affecting even those other national crises that we have. In order for us to be able to get to a vaccine or for tests to be effectively provided and administered, you need systems to be well protected. And so in order to do that, we think it's important not only for this administration, but future administrations in perpetuity to have a central authority identified within the White House.
It is in the name of your organization, so I'm not surprised to see accountability as a factor in the work that you're doing. You and your team write, remains unclear which official ultimately maintains responsibility not only for coordinating execution of the implementation plan, but also holding federal agencies accountable once activities are implemented. What kind of accountability, I guess, what's the carrot and stick, I suppose, that would be appropriate for that office, or is that not in the purvey of the work that you did, Nick?
Well, I think it's endemic in other things that we've seen. So you pointed out last week in talking about our report with Ari Schwartz, the reality that we have many dashboards already out there that are holding agencies accountable on things like IT modernization. So thinking about the BITAR scorecard, or even federal government security itself. You know, we've seen strides made by the Inspector General community, by the agencies themselves to measure the maturity of their information security programs. I think we're looking for something here as well. We think the strategy covers a lot of the issues that GAO has been identifying as part of what we consider to be a high-risk area to government. For nearly the last 2 decades, we've been talking about cybersecurity as a major issue area. And we think that a central leader is essential to get to that accountability, to ultimately not only address what the strategy says today, but as we know, cyber threats are continually evolving, becoming more sophisticated. So that strategy and that implementation has to be updated on a continual basis.
We have about 30 seconds left. Nick, you also make a recommendation to the National Security Council. What's that recommendation?
Well, we called for the National Security Council to basically fill those gaps that we identified that are needed within the implementation plan. So ultimately, making sure there's clarity in terms of the targets and how we're going to measure progress towards those targets, and identifying the resources that are going to be needed to overcome and ultimately implement this national strategy.
Nick Marinos of the Government Accountability Office, thank you very much for coming on. It's great to have you here.
Thanks very much, Francis.